Know Christ, a television ministry of the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville, Wisconsin. Here is your host, Reverend Jeff Pedersen.
I've heard the statement that you give credit to where credit is due. Have you ever done anything, like you've made something or you've made a statement that is originally yours and then somebody else takes the credit for it? You know how frustrating that is when somebody takes your work and now claims that it is theirs. And so when we think about creation, well, everything is God's creation. God has created it, and God is the one who has put it all into motion. But how oftentimes do we give God the credit for it? It seems like I always hear, oh, no, God's not the creator. You know, we're not going to give God credit for what God has done. But rather we think about all of these other ways to say, well, no, we give science credit for it, or we give, some other cause credit for creation. But here again, we give credit to where credit is due. And so we may say, well, God creating the universe, that's a statement of faith. Well, of course it is. None of us were there when creation came to be. It's kind of like God's argument with Job. We're saying, were you there at the beginning when I formed everything, the foundations of the world? And so we, just have a lot of theories as far as, how creation came about and so forth. But yet I always like to use the illustration of the onion. Onions have got so many different layers. They've got so many layers to it. And as we go through creation, or as we study, for instance, God and creation, we can look at the different layers. And at some point we can say, well, based on this theory, that this is kind of what we think. Like when somebody says, well, we think that everything came about as a result of the Big Bang theory, or we may say that everything has come as a result of some evolutionary theory. Well, here again, we're talking about layers of the onion. But still, we have to get right down to the very core of the onion. And that's where we have to continue to peel off more and more layers, just to simply say, well, I believe in evolution. It's like, well, no, you got to peel off more layers to the onion to say, to ask the very basic core question. It's the existential question of who created it. Because even with evolution, that means that there has to be something that has created it. It can't just happen on its own. And so that's what we have to wrestle with is who created creation. And to say creation, if you say, well, I believe in this about creation, what you are implying then is that there is a creator. Because a creation only comes about if there's a creator. Think about things that you've created, whether it's something with Play-Doh or a painting, or something that you've done with other materials. To say that I built this or I created it, well, that implies that you are the creator, that you have created this. If somebody were to come along and just say, well, no, you didn't create this, and they gave some explanation or some theory for it, or basically say nobody created it, it just kind of came to be, well, you're going to be kind of shaking your head, and you're going to be getting very frustrated, saying, I don't get it. You make no sense. Why can't you give me a little credit for what I have created here? and your teaching, your definition to say that, no, that painting just came to be, is not going to satisfy. And I think that's so much of it, is that everything that we see, just look around. Everything that you see has been designed and it has been created. And for somebody to and look at anything, whether it's your automobile or the television that you're watching or your cell phone or the furniture that you're sitting on, for somebody to say, well, no, nobody designed that and nobody built that, you'd say that is craziness, that's silliness. And as much as somebody can give an intellectual argument to say that your automobile was not designed or created, you're going to say, but it was. And you're going to have a hard time proving to them that it was. But yet you know that it had a designer and a builder, and that's the way that it is with everything. We are created in the image of God. And so since we are created in the image of God, that God has given us now that same ability to create. Yeah, we have procreation in that we create, and thankfully we have more generations of life. But also that ability to be able to have a vision and have a design and then to build. That's all part of what God has instilled within us, to be created in His image, that as we've been created, that we now also have the ability to create. But that everything has to have a first cause. And so as I look at philosophers, throughout the very beginning, or at least way back to the ancient Greece, the Greek philosophers, they've been always wrestling with the question as far as how did creation come to be? And they had theories. There was one called Anaximander who felt that creation came ex nihilo, that everything came out of nothing. Then there was Thales, that philosopher. He believed that water is the first substance of creation, and everything has come out of water. And we can almost see that we can make that argument saying that water is life. Where there's no water, there's no life. But then there's Anaximenes, who believed that air is the first thing of creation. And so when you look at the first four elements, so to speak, we have earth, water, air, and fire. And so you can make the strong argument, which one of these came first? It's almost like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? When you're looking at earth, water, air, fire, which one of these came first? And you can make that argument to say, well, you need this in order for these others to happen. And pretty soon it's just back and forth to where you finally get to that place where maybe they all were here at the same time. We need all these things in order for life to be in our world today. Well, then there was Heraclitus. And he actually felt that fire was the first element of creation. But then he finally gets to the point where he says that no, that before there was any earth, water, air, or fire, that there was logos. And logos is the Greek word for word. Logos meaning that it is that the origin is that there is a higher being, that there is God. There is God who is the creator. I mean, it's like here again when we start talking about earth, water, air, and fire. I mean, this is getting really down there as far as the layers of the onion, but yet what Heraclides is saying is that, yeah, but we got to get right to the core. We got to get to the core of the onion, so to speak, and that's where he is saying is that it's the Logos. It's God. That is the first cause of creation. And so I'm going to read from John. John chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. And this is a creation story. Creation story based on John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, or the Logos, and the Word Logos was with God, and the Word Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. And then this was verses 1 through 5, and then I'll go down to verse 14. And the Word Logos became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so the Logos is the one who has created all things. And that's what John is saying as he is writing his gospel that's going to also go out to the Greco-Roman, the Gentile world, and to say, but the Creator, the Logos, has become flesh as a human being, as one of us, and that one is Jesus. And so then as we continue on with philosophical thought, that we see that there is Aristotle. And Aristotle says that, well, there's forms, and that there's cause and effect. You can't have an effect unless there's, first of all, a cause. And so once again, if creation is the effect, then what would be the cause of that creation? And that everything has a form. And so saying that God is the cause of creation. And that we have forms. The form that God creates us. And what's special about humanity versus, for instance, the automobiles that are manufactured is that there are forms where these automobiles that are being produced in factories, as far as the model and make, they are identical. Whereas for each one of us, we've all been created in the image of God, but yet each one of us is created uniquely different, very special. And I think that is what is so awesome about all of this, is that we are all created different. But yet, when we look at the form, what is the perfect form of a human being? And that would be Jesus Christ. That Jesus is the perfect form. And that all the rest of us, well, we have our form, but that would be the form if we are trying to be the perfect form, that he would be that image. And so as we look at creation and cause and effect, just how powerful that is, that as we look at a sculptor has in his or her mind this vision, this visual. So they can look at a big chunk of stone and they can kind of look into the stone, and then they can kind of see the form for which they want to create. And so what they are doing is that they are chiseling away on that rock until they sculpt what it is that they envision, what it is that they see. And so that's what God is always doing, is that God continually is working to chisel us and make us into that form, the form of his holiness. And that's what Jesus is. When we read in Philippians chapter 2, that Jesus being in the form of God did not count equality with God, but rather he humbled himself. And he became a servant, or he became in the form of a human. He was obedient to God, even obedient unto death, so that God now has raised him to new life, raised him from the dead, so that now all of us at the very knee, that we will bow and on our knees, that we will proclaim that Jesus Christ is Savior and Lord. And so this is where we look at God as being the creator of all things. And so now we kind of get into this argument saying, well, what is it? Is it God or is it science? We always kind of feel like there's this big, almost competition that's going on all the time between God and science. And a lot of people lose their faith because they think, well, in order to believe in God, this is how I have to believe. And there seems to be a huge contradiction between what God has taught us and what science has taught us. And so we go to Sunday school class learning this about creation, but then we go to our public school class and then we learn something that's very different. So finally, people are kind of thinking, well, what do I believe? And finally they say, well, it's got to start somewhere, and so I believe that there is God. Or others to say, well, we've got more scientific ways of looking at things and what the Bible is describing, and so I would have to have a tendency to say, well, I believe more in science. But we have to understand that science isn't studying anything that God hasn't created. And we have to see God as being bigger than this little boy over in the corner playing with his Play-Doh on a card table. God is the creator of the universe, and our knowledge is very limited. When we do our best to learn about our little microscopic speck in all of creation that we call our world. And so there comes a place where the sidewalk ends and the wilderness begins. And so that's why we're all walking by faith. Whatever your statement is, here again, we can only go so far as our knowledge goes. But here again, even with that knowledge, we're only learning about the principles and the points that God has instilled in creation. And so as I think about creation, that God has created all things, but science is God letting humanity look into his workshop. And that is, what is so fascinating and so exciting. I just kind of like to use the illustration of a clock. We can look at the face of a clock and say that that is time. But if you look at the gears behind the face of the clock and look at the gears of the clock, we would say, well, that's time, or this is how time works and how fascinating it all is. And so as we think about all the laws of physics, or as I think about another one of those ancient philosophers named Pythagoras, he believed that in the beginning was numbers. He was saying, well, before there was fire, before there was earth and water and air, there's numbers and formulas. And that it's like that God is like he's like the director of an orchestra that, you look at all of creation and it's almost like music with its notes and how it all comes and flows together. That together it's like a beautiful song that's out there. And so that's where we look at creation and how God has created all things and that we study these things. And so I knew a man who was a scientist, a very strong and devout Christian, and one of the things that, we started talking about the Big Bang Theory. And this is to describe that everything was kind of together, and then boom, there's this big explosion, and now creation has been expanding into this expanse, into this void that we call space, and how it's all in order. But what he said is he was telling me, he says, in science we have what we call the second law of thermodynamics. And he says part of this law means that if something is in order and now it's in chaos, it's going to take something greater than itself to bring order to it again. And so as we're talking about the Big Bang Theory, and as we're talking about creation, where everything was all of a sudden in a state of chaos, but now it's come together in an order that is, that is more precise than a clock. That it's going to take something greater than itself in order to do that. And so I said to him, well, the only thing that could be then would be God. And he went, yeah, that's the only thing that can do it. Well, then I said, well, then, based on this, if science really believes in the second law of thermodynamics, then there shouldn't be any atheist scientists. And once again, he went like this. Exactly. Now, this is a man who's got science textbooks that are being used by universities throughout the world. And so we talk about different theories. Yeah, could God create everything and ex nihilo out of nothing? Well, of course God could. Could God create everything in 7 days or 6 days and rest on the seventh? Well, of course God could. Could God create everything in an evolutionary progression over the course of millions, billions of years? Well, of course God could. Maybe the big question for us today is that, is God creating today? As we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, the Apostle Paul writes that in Christ we are a new creation. The old things have passed away, the new has come. That yes, creation we could say is very old. It's been around for, well, who knows how many years. But the question is creation new today? As we look at springtime, say, well, yeah, it's just like it's brand new. It's almost like it's just has come right out of the factory. But that God is creating you anew every day, that He's creating you in that form that we were talking about. Molding and making, chiseling, and He's using the Holy Spirit so that we can continue to grow in the image and the likeness of the Logos, the origin of creation, who is Jesus Christ. That our God who has created us has also now redeemed us. And so as we look at different texts and studies, we say, well, how about the creation story right at the beginning of the Bible? Well, yeah, like I said, could God create in 6 days? I say, well, yes, He could. But I'm going to read some of this. I'm going to start from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1, and then I will go on all the way then to verse 27. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Okay, so that would now suggest, that everything was in a state of chaos. The Big Bang has happened, and so now it's the Spirit of God that's bringing order to creation again. Okay, then verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. Now, do you see where this is all written in hymnic form, like somebody's writing a hymn here, where you got the verse and then you got the refrain? Okay, so now we'll go to the next verse. whether it's, okay, it's just like a verse of a hymn. And God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse and the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now we got the next verse. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered water he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to the various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. Well, now we have the next verse. And God said, let there be light in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse and the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And so that was, I'm quitting here at verse 19, but to give you that this was written as a hymn that was used in their worship. You know, just like, well, we have hymns that have been used in our worship services. I think of This Is My Father's World. This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears all nature sings, and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, his hand the wonders wrought. How great thou art, O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hand hath made. I see the stars, I see the mighty thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And so these are statements of faith. The statement of faith that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Statements of faith that God continues to create and renew us this day.
You have been watching To Know Christ with Reverend Jeff Pedersen, pastor of the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville, Wisconsin. Thank you for watching, and tune in again next week for To Know Christ.